Right. Hi, my name's Jay Stapley. I am a guitarist, writer, producer. I have done sessions, tours for everything ranging from jingles to multi-million selling albums, and played everywhere from wine bars up to football stadiums. I'm very fortunate in that I am still doing sessions, tours, and stuff. I thought the session industry was dead, but I recently joined a couple of agencies online, and I've been doing online sessions for people all over the world, which is intriguing. And I owe a vote of thanks to the sadly recently departed Avicii, who made guitars, particularly acoustic guitars, legal in EDM. I get quite a lot of sessions doing acoustic guitar stuff for dance music producers. And it's interesting. It's very different from the kind of sessions I used to do, because a lot of EDM producers, they don't send you a 3.5 or 4 minute song structure. They just send you a groove over a couple of chords, and what they want from you is stuff that they can take loops from and samples from. So I tend to send them back 2 or 3 passes of acoustic guitar, just playing stuff with looping in mind. So I'll make sure you can keep clean entry and exit points and clean looping points. I think one of the reasons I'm still here is that quite early on I realised that the secret to longevity in the music industry is royalty-based income, because you only have to write it once. And I do a lot of what's called library music, which is the musical equivalent of things like the Getty Images library, where if a magazine, for example, doesn't have the budget to commission a photographer to take precisely the picture they want, they go to the library and they search through and they find one that does what they want, and then pay a royalty to use it. The same exists with music, and I do loads of library music that goes on earning forever, really. In terms of sessions, it's a huge variety. I learned my craft as a session musician when I first moved to London in 1979, I think. And I'd been playing in a band and touring Germany in a transit van, and I thought, yeah, okay, this is kind of fun, but not that much fun after you've done it for 2 years, sleeping on people's floors and such. And I'd like to get into sessions. And my first session was for a jingle writer, advertising music, jingles, called Billy Gray. And I asked an old session hand, I said, what's your advice? And he said, just go along, sit in your chair, play your chords, keep quiet, watch and learn, which was great advice. And at the time, the jingle business was huge, absolutely huge. We used to do demos as well as master versions. And I would drive into Soho every morning, go to the first studio of the day and park the car. And at the time, they didn't really enforce parking tickets. So like most musicians, I had a sheaf of parking tickets in the back of my car. I would park the car, go to the first studio of the day, and the first job might be reggae. So you do that, take an hour, a couple of hours, go to the next studio for the next job, which might be metal. Do that. Next studio, that might be folk. So you'd have to be able to get these styles and sounds really quickly, and to be able, even if it's something you'd never heard before, to be able to quickly get a reasonably authentic sounding version of it. Then back to the car, throw the parking tickets in the back, drive home, try to get to sleep with the last jingle of the day running through your head, which was always difficult. And then the next day we'd do it all over again. I would also do a lot of everything ranging from publishers' demos to recordings for release. And the session industry was vibrant at the time. It was fabulous. There was so much work. Yeah. One of the things I used to do also was, because I'd been touring in Germany with an artist called Julian Dawson, and we had recorded an album at the legendary Cannes studio, the Inner Space studio, that was the studio owned by the German avant-garde group Cannes. I'd done a record there, and the producer, the guy who really ran the studio, was a producer, and he used to ask me to go and play on records, and I would fly to Cologne and do 2 or 3 days, do all the guitars on a record. I'd do that several times a year, and one day the artist whose record I was doing, we got on very well, and he really liked what I did, and he became my tame artist. Every session musician needs a tame artist. You need one artist for whom you drop everything else. And this guy became the artist who, when he worked, I worked, both recording and live. His name was Westernhagen, spelt with a W. In English, Westernhagen, but it's pronounced Westernhagen. And we went from playing 2,000-seater halls to playing football stadiums by the end of the 90s. Sold millions of records every time. So he was my tame artist, and that was handy. Too many stories from the dressing room, not all of which are appropriate to tell. But we had a great time, and because we were making so much money, we always had really good bands. We used to make the records in London usually, Olympic or Metropolis or Townhouse, and we had some great players in the band. We had the legend that is Andy Newmark on drums for a couple of records. Another great drummer, Blair Cunningham, did a couple of records with us. Really superb musicians. Pete Wingfield co-produced a lot of them. Julian Crampton played bass. The Kick Horns. Loads of good people. We made good records, and he was a great writer. And this, to me, is the secret of it. I learned over the course of the years that the songs are everything. Along the way, I also played with other people. My first proper tour was with Slim Whitman in 1970 something. For those of you that don't know, Slim Whitman was one of the great American country and western artists, and he sang in a lovely sort of light, what's called a countertenor, occasionally slipping into falsetto. One of his most best-known songs was "I'll Take You Home Again, Kathleen," the opening line of which goes, "I'll take you home again, Kathleen." And that octave break into falsetto was a major feature of what he did. And he used to warm up beside the stage. We were playing theatres, cinemas, or Gaumont, Odeon cinemas and what have you, and there'd be a curtain in front of the band. The band would be on stage ready to go. Slim would be at the side of the stage warming up. So you'd hear him go, "Ooh, ooh," just getting it nicely warmed up. And one night he was warming up and it wasn't working. He was going, "Ooh, ooh, ah." He couldn't get it. So from the side of the stage we heard, "Ooh," and it was perfect. And the curtain opened on the band collapsing with laughter at what they'd just heard. That was my first proper tour. And then I got a phone call from one of the jingle guys I used to work for, a guy called David Dundas, who was a genius. David, he used to sit there and stare into space and then do something beautiful. He was also an aristocrat. He was a lord, although he never took his seat in the House of Lords. But American advertising people loved him because he was a proper lord. So he used to do all the really big budget American stuff. TWA, Seagram's, the distillery company, and all the big drinks things. But he called me one day. He said, did Roger Waters call you? And I went, no, should he? And he said, yeah, he will. And sure enough, a couple of days later, I had a phone call from Roger Waters, who had left the Pink Floyd probably about a year before and done his first solo record with Eric Clapton playing guitar. And it turned out that he was looking for a guitarist to go on tour with. And excuse me. And I subsequently discovered that what he wanted to do was, he'd gone on tour with Eric Clapton to promote the record, which was called The Pros and Cons of Hitchhiking or something. Yeah, that's what it was called, actually, The Pros and Cons of Hitchhiking. And Clapton had played on the record. So he went on tour with Clapton on guitar. And I've subsequently found out that the reason why he went on tour again to promote to do this record again was that he wanted to find out if he could sell tickets without a big name guitarist in the band. So he asked all his friends if they knew a really good guitarist who was completely unknown. One of his friends, I think his wife was David Dundas's wife's cousin or something. And at the dinner table one night, he said to David, do you know, I'm looking for a guitarist, a good but unknown guitarist. And David said, yeah, I'll give you a number, call this guy. And that was me. So at the tender age of 28, we went out on the road. I went to America for the first time, which was an extraordinary experience. We were playing 12, 15,000 seater hockey arenas, the kind of indoor arenas. And it was interesting for me because I remember the first 5 minutes of the first gig being quite scared, as you would be, having never played anything bigger than a 1,000 seater theatre before. But 5 minutes in, I realised actually the rules are the same, actually. You do your gig. You don't get drunk before the show. You stay straight. You do your gig. Just play what you got to play. Don't panic. Don't try and overdo it. Don't try and be brilliant. Just play, and it'll be fine. And I realised that I could do this. And also Andy Newmark was in the band as well on drums, and I found myself playing with one of the world's greatest session musicians, and he accepted me like an equal. And I kind of thought, okay, I can do this. I can play with the big boys. So that was the first time I worked with Roger. We then did a film soundtrack to a film called When the Wind Blows, which was a cartoon by Raymond Briggs, who did The Snowman. It was a cartoon about what to do in the event of nuclear war. I tried explaining to my kids what the Cold War was like. If you weren't alive in the Cold War, you won't really understand. We lived in very real awareness of the potential for nuclear war, because America and Russia were facing each other down, and we were in the middle. George Orwell, I think, referred to us as Airstrip 1. Britain was Airstrip 1. America used us as an airstrip. We were where all its a lot of its bombers were based. So we were a prime target. And Roger was very politically aware, always has been, still is, and he was one of the musicians who did the music for the soundtrack for this film called When the Wind Blows, in which a dear, sweet old English couple, pensioners, find themselves following government advice in the event of a nuclear explosion. You get in the cupboard under the stairs. Fat lot of good that was going to do you, but that was the advice we were given at the time. Then we did the next Roger Waters solo album, which was called Radio Chaos, spelled Kaos, which was an intriguing project. I think his record company had told him he had to do something modern. So he had engaged a producer called Ian Ritchie, who I had known from doing sessions and jingles. And Ian was one of the first people to get into computer music. And he had the BBC Acorn computer. He actually wrote one of the first books on computer music. And he produced this record. And it was very modern sounding. It was great. It was an excellent record. But Roger did it kind of under sufferance, I think. And then we toured that. Went to the States again. One of my funniest stories from that tour was that we used to have a break in the show where he would play the video of the early Floyd singing, I think it was Arnold Lane, and they'd shot a black and white video on a beach somewhere where they all walked backwards and fell over, and it was all speeded up and all that. And we used to sit down at a table on the stage, and the tour manager would come through the door in the back of the stage with a tray of drinks and just hand out the drinks, and we'd sit there and under this umbrella at a table and watch the video. And one night we're sitting there at the table and the stage door opened, and instead of the tour manager emerging onto the stage, a Domino's pizza man came through the door, found himself in front of 20,000 people, froze for a minute, and then went, "Your pizza, sir?" and served us pizzas. He's probably still dining out on that story, but he had the presence of mind. Although he was initially quite shocked, he soon gathered himself together. We toured the States. Oh, God, we seemed to be out forever. We were out for months. Months and months and months. We went to Nassau, to Compass Point Studio in the Bahamas, to make a record. The record turned out to be the one that was called Amused to Death, although none of the sessions from Nassau survived. He subsequently remade it with Pat Leonard, I think, who was Madonna's producer. But we spent a month in Nassau making this record. And Compass Point Studios was a fantastic place. I remember wandering into the tape store one day and looking at the racks of multi-track tapes, and there's the original multi-track to Bob Marley albums and Grace Jones albums and Robert Palmer albums, and all this stuff there. But they had a pretty relaxed attitude. This was the Bahamas, and Roger was, how can I put it, not quite as laid back. So he'd ask, is the maintenance man coming tomorrow? There'd be a rustly fader on one of the channels, it'd say that needs fixing. They'd say, yeah, okay. So the next day we're going to the studio and it hadn't been fixed, and it'd say, when are they coming to fix that? And they go, oh man, soon come. And he would start fuming about it. The maintenance man at Compass Point was a guy called Eric from Alabama, and he had a flat over the road. The studio's right by the ocean, and there's a road that runs along by the ocean, and on the ocean side of the road there are some apartments, and Eric, the maintenance man, had an apartment there. And he had a balcony that faced out onto the sea, and he had 2 fishing rods constantly in place on this balcony, and he had a freezer full of shark steaks. But being a white American boy from Alabama, he had certain preconceived ideas, shall we say, about people of colour. And one day we went out, me and Nick Griffiths, the engineer, also sadly departed, God bless him. Me and Nick Griffiths and Eric went out for a drive one evening, late afternoon. And we're driving back past the beach and we could hear a boom, 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 a boom, 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 coming from the beach. And we could see all these people with a sound system that were sort of grooving away on the beach. And Nick and I, we were Londoners. We were entirely familiar with Afro-Caribbean people and not scared at all. We said, oh, go on, let's go and see what's going on. Eric, the Alabama boy, is going, oh, man, they'll kill us. They're going to kill us. No, man. Eric, shut up. Come on. So we walked down onto the beach and started just walking along, you know. And this big guy comes up to us. He said, hey, man. And Eric goes, run, man, run, they're going to kill us. I go, shut up, Eric. I said, yes, hello. He said, you want a beer? Thank you very much. So we ended up spending a couple of hours on the beach with these local guys, drinking cold beer and enjoying the reggae music, you know. Anyway, then we finished our month there and we went back on the road. It was October. We spent October in Nassau, so back to North America in November. And the plane ride back up to, I can't remember where it was, it might even have been Boston or something, it was an empty 747, and it was the worst turbulence I've ever experienced in an aircraft, ever. And we finished off the tour. We did another month or 6 weeks or something and came home. And I wasn't sure about that experience. We were out for a long time. And when you're on the road at that level, you live in a weird sort of bubble. Yeah, you have everything done for you, great. You know, all your guitars are looked after, you're fed every night, you've got hotels, transport, whatever it is, spending money a day, and you're being very well paid. But it was a long time. And when I got home, it took me a few weeks to pick up session work again. The other thing about coming home from America, I remember this first time I went to America. You know, Americans are glorious in their what James Cameron, the English journalist in the 50s and 60s, described as their terrible innocence. He coined that phrase when he was watching the atomic bomb tests at the Bikini Atoll. He described the Americans as having terrible innocence. But it was my first exposure to the can-do mentality of Americans. And I came home full of ideas and started saying to people, hey, let's do this. And they would go, oh, I don't know, man, I don't know about that. Not sure about that. Quite a cultural contrast. So we came home from America for a variety of reasons. For a variety of reasons, we didn't work together again. One of which was, I think I effectively handed in my notice I was reading a book by Clive James on a plane one day, and he quoted Joyce Grenfell, a great English comedian and actress, as saying, people who regard themselves as exceptionally gifted have fewer, not more, excuses for behaving badly. And Roger had been a bit difficult, I think is the word. If you read Nick Mason's book on the Floyd, he also describes him as being difficult. And he'd been quite difficult with me. So I underlined this sentence and handed Roger the book, knowing that that probably meant that that would be the last time he would call me, and indeed it was. But at the time, the Westenhagen, the German artist, was starting to get busy, and I didn't really miss the work, and I certainly didn't miss being out on the road for 9 months at a time. It's too much. It's madness. You lose touch with your family, you know, and we were having... I wasn't having kids by then, but you just lose touch with your family, you lose touch with your work at home, and you kind of end up doing it all the time. It's the only thing you do. And it didn't distress me not to be doing that all the time. But it was a fantastic learning experience. It taught me a lot. The other guitar player in the band was Andy Fairweather-Lowe, who had been a 60s pop star in a band called Amen Corner, and then had stopped being a pop star, because that happens to you sometimes when you're a pop star. Through no fault of your own, you suddenly stop being a pop star. But he had always loved Ry Cooder's music, and he had taken the opportunity when Ry Cooder came to tour England. Andy knew the promoter or whatever and said, "Listen, can I be his driver?" I goes, "What? You want to be what? You're a pop star." He goes, No. I want to drive Ry Cooder." So he drove Ry Cooder around England and got to know him. And they started playing guitar together, and Ry Cooder showed him all his stuff. And I learned from Andy a huge amount about sound and space. And one of the big secrets to sounding tough, there's two big secrets to sounding tough. One of them is to play as relaxed as you can, paradoxically. The other is that the more distorted your sound is, the more space it occupies, and therefore the more it has to be squashed when you're mixing the record. And if you want to sound truly tough, only play 2 or 3 strings at a time, use your thumb and your fingers, and quite a clean sound, just a bit of crunch, not full-blooded distortion. And that was a fascinating lesson to learn, and influenced my playing style hugely. Still does. Who else was in the band? Paul Carrick was in the band, in Roger's band at the time, singing. Graham Broad, I met Graham Broad, the drummer. And we were kind of on the cutting edge of technology as well, actually. It was one of the very early technological records. And to play it live, we all had headphones and a click. Graham was triggering samples, which at the time was cutting edge for live work. But we had there was one piece of technology that was surprisingly kludgy for the time, and I still don't know why he didn't do this. We could have done this much more intelligently. We had the kids' choir from Another Brick in the Wall singing, "We don't need no education." And the way that it was done live was that he had a multi-track tape recorder and somebody had to hit play. So, and the pickup speed of the tape was, not always the same. So some nights you'd get to the end of the phrase, down, 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 1, 2, 3, 4. We don't need, but it wouldn't always be right. So you go down, 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 1, 2, 3, 4. We don't need. So every night you were just on tenterhooks, wondering where the vocal was going to come in. Should have just been a sample trigger on an S1000. Would have been easy. I still don't understand why. If anybody knows, let me know. But yeah, it was pretty technologically advanced. And I used to do, because I had somewhere along the line. Okay, this is how I got into this situation. When I left the band that I'd been touring Germany with in a transit van in 1981 and decided I didn't want to do this anymore and wanted to become a session musician, I remember sitting in my housing co-op place in Harlesden, that was a house that was falling down while it was waiting repaired. It had one habitable room, but it only cost me £9 a month. It was nothing, so I could afford to not get a day job, which is crucial. I was sitting there gazing at the vast expanse of white in my diary, and I had a phone call from a guy called Pete Wilshire, who was a pedal steel guitarist who lived in London. And he said, "I've just given your name to Alan Townsend at Roland, the Japanese synth manufacturing company." He said they're looking for somebody to demonstrate their guitar synthesizer equipment. And this was the early days before MIDI, actually. Excuse me. This was the early days before MIDI. But they had developed this way of triggering a synthesizer from a guitar. He said, "Would you like to come down to the warehouse in Brentford and have a look?" And I went, "Yeah, okay." Went down and had a look at this thing and was fascinated by it. And they said, "Okay, we're doing a month-long tour of the UK, going to all our shops, all our main dealers. Would you like the job as guitarist?" I went, "Yeah." So I had to demonstrate the early guitar synths. They distributed Washburn guitars at the time and Boss pedals. And we went out on the road, and we'd go to shops or set up in a hotel conference suite, and they would invite all their customers and we'd show them the latest equipment. And that got me into technology, and in the long run that also helped save me as a session musician, because when the studios died and the session industry changed because of piracy, people nicking recorded music and governments just ignoring it, because I could record myself to a professional standard, I was doing little demos for people, and I'd started learning about production, and this all came from learning about equipment and gear, from demonstrating from Roland, for Roland. And whereas most guitarists were purists, "Oh no, I only want a valve amp, no, I'm not interested in all that stuff, no, I just want to plug my guitar into a valve amp and turn it up." Because I was a little more open-minded, shall we say, he said, expecting immediately the brickbats. Won't be the first time. I'd got interested in all this stuff. And on that Roger Waters Radio Chaos tour, I used to play a lot of synthesizer parts. There's a track called 3 Minute Warning that goes into The Tide is Turning, and the other keyboard players were occupied, and I used to play a synth pad. Okay, another technology-related story from the Roger Waters Radio Chaos tour. The first tour I did with him, we rehearsed at Shepperton. Massive rehearsal room, huge. It was a film set. And I could take what I wanted from the Pink Floyd amp store. So I had one of Gilmore's high-watt amps and 4x12s, and you could play it at a volume that made it sustain nicely without being heavily distorted. The Radio Chaos tour, we started rehearsals in Roger's billiards room at his house in East Sheen. And it was tiny, so I couldn't really. My gear at the time, I was using Roland GP8 guitar effects processor, and a JC120 amp, and I knew it sounded fine at gig volume. It was great, but we were playing so quietly in there that it didn't sound the way that I knew it would sound when we got out on the road. So I just started going on about, oh, he said, you need a proper valve amp. You need a good old valve amp. So I went, okay. So they hired me an old tweed Fender Twin. Sounded all right. I mean, you still couldn't really crank it up, but, So the first night on tour, we start playing the first song of the night. I start playing nothing. This old Fender amp had just given up. But I'd kept my old rig in the system on stage. And I said to my guitar tech, switch back to the old rig. So I'm back to my GP8 and my JC120 amp. And he went, okay. And in the interval, Rod said to me, see, guitar sounds amazing. I was right about that amp, wasn't I? And I never said anything. I still regret it to this day that I didn't point out that actually it was my rig that he hated that we were using. So if you ever see this, Rog, nah.